Augustine tells the story of a friend's death and of his own grief about that death. This story takes up a large part of Book 4, in fact, the central part. And that can seem like a lot of ink to spill over one incident, even one with a big emotional impact like the death of the friend had. But we may assume that Augustine, a very careful writer, doesn't waste ink. So what is he up to here? First, let's review the story. There is a childhood buddy who becomes a close friend of Augustine when Augustine returns home from Carthage to take a teaching job. They now are young adults, probably around 19 or 20 years old. And in this friendship, Augustine tries to convert his old friend to Manichaeism. Augustine is a very persuasive talker, obviously very smart, we know this, and he wants to try to persuade people of his own ideas. So he tries to convert this friend to Manichaeism. And the friend is showing possibly some interest in this, and I think it would be difficult if you were a friend of St. Augustine to try to put Augustine at arm's length in his arguments. This friend falls sick, and it turns out that he was already a catechumen in the Christian faith. And when he is sick, he becomes unconscious, and his family has him baptized privately while he's unconscious, assuming that he is going to die. Now, it apparently was a practice in North Africa at that time that if a person was unconscious and if they were a catechumen in the Christian church, that they could go ahead and be baptized without their consultation. Well, St. Augustine visits the friend in bed after the friend comes around from being unconscious, and Augustine makes fun of the baptism because Manichaeans thought that baptism was a way too physical thing, that it wasn't spiritual. And so Augustine ridicules the baptism. And what the friend does is to severely chastise St. Augustine about this criticism, and he tells Augustine, if you want to remain my friend, you are not to make fun of my baptism or in any way try to take me away from my Catholic faith and make me a Manichae. Well, Augustine leaves his friend and goes away and expecting his friend to recover, but his friend doesn't recover. His friend dies, and Augustine is stricken by grief. He is stricken by a deep, dark depression, a grief that will not go away. Everything seems ugly to St. Augustine. Every association of anything in his hometown with his friend is to him a terrible reminder of grief. One could be reminded of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, about the grief that Hamlet experiences after his father's death, to the point that Hamlet wonders whether he should live or not, whether he should take his own life, the famous lines, to be or not to be, that is the question. In a way, Augustine, more than about 1,000 years earlier from Shakespeare, is asking that kind of a question right now. Should I be or should I not be? It seems like my life is over now that my friend's life is over. Well, on the surface of it, this story is an engaging series of anecdotes about the drama of grief. And we can recall earlier in the Confessions how Augustine had lamented the false grief he experienced while watching tragedies or while reading tragic stories. We might remember the story of Aeneas and Dido that he wept over as a child, and he got upset with himself that he was expressing grief at that time over things that were fictitious, over things that were false. Well, this would seem to be a real good opportunity in Augustine's life now, where grief is quite real. He's actually lost a real friend. It would seem that grief at a friend's death is the real thing, not a fake thing like it was in watching or reading tragedies. So we could be forgiven for wondering, what is the problem, Augustine? But there is a connection between the grief that Augustine experienced over the tragedies and the grief that Augustine is experiencing over his friend. Augustine sees that both of these types of grief are disordered. The first because it was fake, aimed at no real good at all. The second one because the darkness of Augustine's grief at the loss of his friend has no good object in sight. It is a dark depression that leads to a kind of a nothingness. Augustine's grieving for his dead friend could not bring his dead friend back to life, nor could Augustine see that his friend was now actually in God's care, because Augustine didn't believe in a God like that at this point. In essence, Augustine had made an idol out of his friend, out of his love for this friend, and out of this friendship. Now, he had not seen the deeper meaning of mortality in a world created and redeemed by God, because at this point in his life, Augustine did not believe in a world created and redeemed by God. Rather than viewing the death of his friend as a chapter in a divine drama of love, Augustine saw it as the death of love itself. When his friend died, Augustine thought that love died with it, because he'd made a kind of an idol out of this friendship. He saw it at that time as the end of meaning in his own life. With his friend gone, what's the meaning of my life now? And Augustine said very powerfully here in Book 4, I had become to myself a vast problem. A remarkable thing to say. Augustine's life had become incoherent. He was seeking for truth and love, but truth was obscured by fantasies, as we learn in his reflection on his seeking of truth and Manichaeism and other places. And love seemed to end permanently in death, so neither truth nor love is permanent. In retrospect, from Augustine's perspective as the writer of the Confessions, all of this was madness, and that's a term that Augustine uses. He had come to understand truth and love at this point in life when he was writing the Confessions as coming together and joining in Christ. Truth and love coming together and joining in Christ. And so, truth, love, and life are everlasting. So to grieve overly for the loss of a loved one is a failure properly to understand truth or love or life. At the end of Book 4, Augustine reflects on Christ in the following way. He says, but our very life came down to earth and bore our death and slew it with the very abundance of his own life. For he did not delay, but ran through the world crying out by words, deeds, death, life, descent, ascension, crying aloud to us to return to him. And he, Christ, departed from our sight, that we might return to our hearts and find Christ there. For Christ left us, and behold, he is here. He could not be with us for long as a man on this earth, yet he did not leave us. Even now, after life itself has come down to you, will you not ascend and live?